a genetic death sentence written in DNA before birth, a disease that would steal everything: movement, memory, identity, piece by piece, year by year, until nothing remained but a body that no longer remembered how to be human. When 28-year-old Isabella Rodriguez walked onto the America's Got Talent stage, she carried with her the weight of knowing exactly how her story would end. Huntington's disease had already begun its work, turning her once perfect dancer's body into something unpredictable, uncontrollable, increasingly foreign. Simon Cowell thought he was about to judge another contemporary dance routine. He had no idea he was about to witness someone transform their genetic curse into the most powerful artistic statement he'd ever seen. What Izzy did in the next 4 minutes would challenge everything anyone thought they knew about disability, about performance, about what it means to dance when your body is actively betraying you. When she began to move, when every involuntary jerk became intentional artistry and every tremor became purposeful expression, Simon Cowell realized he wasn't watching someone fight their disease, he was watching someone dance with it, literally partnering with the condition that would eventually destroy her to create something beautiful while she still could. Let me take you back to the moments before Isabella Rodriguez proved that even genetic destiny can't silence the music that lives in a dancer's soul. It was Wednesday evening at the Dolby Theater in Los Angeles, and America's Got Talent was in the middle of what would become its most medically heartbreaking yet artistically triumphant season. The familiar energy buzzed through the venue, 3,400 audience members filling the red velvet seats, many of them from neurological research communities and Huntington's disease support groups who had heard about Izzy's unprecedented approach to living with a progressive neurological condition. Simon Cowell sat at the judge's table in his signature black t-shirt and perfectly tailored blazer, but tonight his expression carried more gravity than usual. The producers had briefed him about this particular contestant in terms that were both inspiring and devastating. They'd explained that he might be witnessing someone's final professional performance, not by choice, but by genetic inevitability. Sofia Vergara was unusually quiet, having been deeply moved during the pre-show briefing about Izzy's condition and her decision to perform publicly while managing a disease that made every movement unpredictable. Heidi Klum and Howie Mandel were both subdued, understanding that they were about to witness something that challenged every assumption about what should be possible on a performance stage. Terry Crews had spent extra time preparing for this introduction, knowing that his words needed to honor both Izzy's courage and the reality of what she was facing. The evening had already been emotional, but everyone involved in the production understood that what was about to happen would be different. This wasn't about discovering talent. This was about witnessing determination, about seeing whether art could triumph over genetics, whether the human spirit could dance even when the body was systematically failing. Backstage, Isabella Rodriguez sat in the contestant waiting area, but she wasn't sitting still. Even while trying to remain calm, her body moved in small, involuntary jerks, the early symptoms of Huntington's disease that would only get worse with time. At 28, she still looked like the principal dancer she had been just 2 years ago, but close observation revealed the subtle signs of neurological degeneration, slight tremors in her hands, unexpected facial tics, a careful way of moving that suggested muscles that no longer responded with complete reliability. Beside her sat Dr. Miguel Rodriguez, her older brother and a neurologist who understood better than anyone else exactly what Izzy was facing and exactly how courageous it was for her to be here tonight. "Izzy, you know I have to ask one more time," Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of both medical expertise and brotherly love. "Your symptoms have progressed since your last evaluation. The stress of performance could trigger more severe choric movements. Are you sure you want to risk this?" Izzy looked at her brother with eyes that held the fierce determination that had made her one of the most promising dancers of her generation before Huntington's had derailed everything. "Miguel, You know the statistics better than anyone. Early onset Huntington's, aggressive progression, complete loss of motor control within 10 years, dementia within 15, death by 40. Her voice was calm, matter of fact, though punctuated by small, involuntary vocalizations that she had learned to work around. If I don't dance now, while I still have some control, I may never dance again. The journey to this moment had been swift and devastating. Izzy had been at the peak of her career, principal dancer with the American Ballet Theater, guest performer with companies around the world, reviews that described her as poetry in motion. Then came the genetic test results that she had put off for years, knowing that her father had died of Huntington's when she was 12. The diagnosis had come 18 months ago, delivered by a neurologist who wasn't her brother, in clinical terms that felt like a countdown timer being activated. Huntington's disease, early onset variant with aggressive progression markers, the doctor had said. I'm sorry, but you need to prepare for significant cognitive and motor decline over the next decade. But Izzy had refused to accept that timeline as the end of her story. She had modified her training, worked with movement therapists, and most importantly, had begun developing choreography that incorporated the unpredictability of her symptoms rather than fighting against them. Dance isn't just what I do, she had told Miguel months ago when he first suggested she consider early retirement. Dance is who I am. Huntington's can take my control, but it can't take my artistry unless I let it. Isabella Rodriguez, called Maria, one of the production assistants, her voice carrying special gentleness, since everyone on staff had been briefed on Izzy's condition. Izzy stood up slowly, using the careful, deliberate movements that had become necessary as her motor control became less reliable. She wore a flowing red contemporary dance dress that had been specially designed to move with her body while disguising any loss of coordination. In her mind, she ran through the 4-minute routine she had choreographed specifically for this moment, a piece that acknowledged her limitations while celebrating everything her body could still do. Remember what we talked about, Miguel said, standing to embrace his sister. If you feel the movements becoming too severe, if you lose spatial awareness, if you feel unsafe, stop. The performance isn't worth an injury that could accelerate your decline. Izzy hugged her brother tightly, knowing that his medical training made watching her perform an act of torture for him. Miguel, I've been managing this condition for 18 months. I know my body, I know my limits, and I know that if I don't do this now, I'll spend whatever good years I have left regretting that I let fear make my decisions instead of love. She pulled back and looked him in the eyes. And I need you to trust that this isn't recklessness. This is me choosing how my story as a dancer ends, on my terms with my art, showing the world that Huntington's might change how I move, but it can't stop me from moving. Terry Crew's voice carried across the theater with unusual gentleness. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Isabella Rodriguez. The curtain rose, and Izzy began the walk that would either be her triumphant finale or a public demonstration of the cruelty of genetic disease. The audience's reaction was immediate and complex. Izzy moved with the unmistakable training of a professional dancer, but there was something in her gait that suggested effort where there had once been effortlessness. She walked like someone who could no longer trust that her body would do exactly what she asked of it, but who refused to let that uncertainty show as weakness. Simon leaned forward, studying Izzy with a mixture of admiration and concern. There was something about this young woman that commanded attention, not just through her obvious training and poise, but through the courage that was evident in every carefully placed step. "Good evening," Terry said warmly as Izzy reached center stage, where the lighting had been specially designed to accommodate the unpredictable nature of her movements. "Good evening," Izzy replied, though her voice carried small, involuntary sounds that she had learned to incorporate naturally into her speech patterns. "Tell us your name and where you're from." "My name is Isabella Rodriguez. I'm 28 years old, and I'm from New York, where I've been dancing since I was 4 years old." "And what kind of dance do you do, Isabella?" Izzy's expression became more serious, more focused. I was a principal dancer with American Ballet Theater until 18 months ago, when I was diagnosed with Huntington's disease. Tonight, I'm performing contemporary dance that I choreographed specifically to work with my condition rather than against it. A murmur of concern and admiration rippled through the audience, understanding immediately that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Can you tell us about Huntington's disease and how it affects your dancing? Terry asked gently. Izzy nodded, having prepared for this question. Huntington's is a genetic neurological condition where my brain cells gradually die, affecting my ability to control my movements, my emotions, and eventually my thinking. For a dancer, this means my body sometimes moves when I don't want it to, or doesn't move when I do want it to. She paused, looking out at the audience with complete honesty, a small facial tic interrupting her expression. But here's what I've learned in the 18 months since my diagnosis. Dance isn't about control. Dance is about expression, about finding beauty in movement, even when that movement isn't what you planned, even when that movement is something your disease is creating instead of your intention. Simon found himself completely absorbed by Izzy's explanation, beginning to understand that he was about to witness something that redefined what performance could mean. So tonight, Izzy continued, her voice gaining strength despite the involuntary sounds, I'm not going to try to dance like I don't have Huntington's. I'm going to dance with Huntington's, making my involuntary movements part of my choreography, turning my symptoms into statements, because this disease might change how I move, but it can't change why I move. That's incredibly brave, Isabella, Terry said, his voice thick with emotion. What's your piece about? It's called Genetic Legacy, and it's about dancing not in spite of what's happening to my body, but because of it. It's about making peace with genetic destiny while refusing to let it define the meaning of your life. Because tomorrow I might have less control than today, but today I can still choose how to use what control I have left. All right, Isabella, Terry said, stepping back carefully. The stage is yours. Izzy positioned herself center stage, but before the music began, she did something unexpected. She looked directly at the camera that would broadcast this moment to millions of viewers. If you're watching this and you're facing your own genetic challenges, your own progressive conditions, your own limitations that are getting worse over time, I want you to know that you can still create beauty. You can still find ways to express who you are. Your symptoms don't have to be just symptoms. They can be part of your art. The music began, a haunting, beautiful piece that seemed to capture both sorrow and celebration, loss and defiance, and Izzy began to move. The opening of her routine was breathtaking. Despite her condition, despite the medical advice about managing her symptoms, despite the unpredictability of her neurological state, Izzy danced with a beauty and intention that seemed to transcend physical limitations. Her movements were fluid, expressive, telling a story of a life lived through dance. Simon watched with growing amazement, understanding that he was witnessing someone perform at the highest level despite facing challenges that would have ended most careers. But as the piece continued, Izzy's condition began to manifest. Her left arm started to jerk involuntarily, her balance became less reliable, and what should have been a controlled turn became an unexpected stumble. Instead of fighting the symptoms, instead of trying to suppress them, Izzy did something extraordinary. She incorporated the involuntary jerk into her choreography, turning the loss of balance into a dramatic fall that became part of the emotional arc of the piece. She made her disease into artistry. The audience gasped, not in dismay, but in recognition of witnessing something unprecedented, someone turning their medical condition into artistic choice, making their neurological symptoms part of their creative expression. As Izzy continued to dance, more symptoms emerged, facial tics that she turned into emotional expressions, involuntary arm movements that she wove into the storytelling, unexpected shifts in balance that became dynamic changes in her spatial relationship to the stage. Sophia was crying openly, recognizing the courage it took for Izzy to perform publicly while managing such an unpredictable condition. Heidi was leaning forward, completely absorbed in the artistic choices Izzy was making in real time. Howie was unusually still, understanding that he was witnessing a redefinition of what performance could mean. But it was Simon's reaction that was most profound. He wasn't just watching a dancer anymore. He was watching someone demonstrate that art isn't about perfection, it's about truth, about finding beauty in struggle, about refusing to let anything silence your creative voice. As Izzy reached the climax of her piece, her movements became more urgent, more desperate, as if she was trying to fit a lifetime of dancing into these 4 minutes. She leaped with involuntary arm jerks that she turned into wing-like gestures. She fell from balance disruptions that she transformed into dramatic floor work. She turned each symptom into intention. The final moment of the routine was the most powerful. Izzy had choreographed an ending that required her to remain standing in a pose of defiant strength. But as she reached that moment, a severe chorea attack caused her entire body to jerk violently, throwing her off balance. For a split second, it looked like the disease had won, that the performance would end in medical symptom rather than artistic statement. Then Izzy did something that would be replayed millions of times across social media and medical conferences. She turned the violent, involuntary movement into the most dramatic, powerful gesture of the entire piece, using the disease's own force to create a movement so striking, so emotionally resonant, that it became the perfect ending to her story. She finished not in the controlled pose she had planned, but in a position created by her Huntingtons that was somehow more beautiful, more meaningful, more honest than anything she could have choreographed. The music ended, and for several seconds, the Dolby Theater was completely silent. Izzy stood in her disease-created final pose, breathing heavily but smiling with the satisfaction of someone who had just said everything they needed to say. Then the audience erupted. 3,400 people rose to their feet in an ovation that lasted over 6 minutes. But this wasn't just appreciation for a performance. It was recognition of courage, celebration of someone who had transformed medical adversity into artistic triumph. But the most powerful reaction was happening at the judges' table. Simon Cowell was not just crying, he was completely overcome. This man who had built his career on technical critique was watching someone demonstrate that the most powerful art comes not from perfect execution, but from perfect truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but his microphone picked up every emotion-choked word. "Isabella," he said, and had to pause to collect himself. "I need you to understand what you just did." Izzy looked at him, still catching her breath, still experiencing small, involuntary movements, but radiating the peace that comes from having expressed exactly what you needed to express. You didn't just dance with a neurological condition tonight. You didn't just overcome symptoms or manage a disability. You transformed genetic destiny into artistic choice. You made your disease into your dance partner. Simon's voice was carrying more emotion than anyone had ever heard from him. You showed every person watching that limitations don't limit creativity, they focus it. That medical conditions don't end artistic expression, they can become artistic expression. That genetic destiny doesn't have to define the meaning of your life. The audience was hanging on every word, understanding that Simon was articulating something profound about human resilience and artistic truth. Isabella, you came here tonight knowing that your condition will get worse, that your time as a dancer is limited, that this might be among your last controlled performances, and you chose to make it a statement about refusing to let illness define what you're capable of creating. Simon looked out at the audience, then back at Izzy. And you did all of this while managing a progressive neurological disease that most people couldn't imagine dealing with, let alone performing through. Izzy was crying now, but they were tears of joy mixed with relief, mixed with pride in what she had just accomplished. "Thank you," she said, her voice interrupted by small, involuntary sounds that somehow made her gratitude more moving. Thank you for seeing that this wasn't about overcoming my Huntington's. It was about dancing with it, making it part of my art, instead of letting it end my art. Simon looked at his fellow judges, then back at Izzy. Isabella Rodriguez, what you shared with us tonight deserves more than just praise. It deserves recognition that will help other people understand that genetic conditions don't have to limit dreams, they can transform them. He walked to his golden buzzer with absolute conviction, but then he paused. Actually, he said, turning to his fellow judges, what Isabella just demonstrated, this redefinition of what's possible, when you partner with your condition instead of fighting it, doesn't that deserve recognition from all of us? Without hesitation, Sophia, Heidi, and Howie stood up and joined Simon at their golden buzzers. Isabella Rodriguez, Simon announced, his voice carrying across the theater, you have just received a unanimous golden buzzer for proving that the most beautiful art comes not from perfect bodies, but from perfect courage. All four judges pressed their buzzers simultaneously. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling, raining down on Izzy, who looked up at it and laughed, a sound that was as beautiful as her dancing, the sound of someone who had used their remaining good time to create something meaningful. Through all the falling gold, Miguel appeared from the wings, tears streaming down his face as he embraced his sister. I'm proud of you, he whispered, not as your doctor, but as your brother. You were magnificent. I was exactly who I needed to be, Izzy replied, and I'm ready for whatever comes next, because I know I used today to its fullest. 3 months later, Isabella Rodriguez won America's Got Talent, but more importantly, her performance sparked a global conversation about redefining ability, about partnering with, rather than fighting genetic conditions, and about finding new ways to express creativity when traditional methods are being systematically dismantled by disease. Her victory performance was choreographed for her advancing symptoms, proving that her artistry could evolve with her condition rather than end because of it. But the numbers and recognition weren't the real story. The real story was in the thousands of messages Izzy received from people with progressive conditions who said her performance gave them permission to work with their diseases rather than only against them. It was in the medical community that began exploring symptom incorporation therapy for neurological patients. It was in the dance programs that started developing adaptive techniques for performers with various degenerative conditions. Simon Cowell, deeply moved by what he had witnessed, established the Isabella Rodriguez Foundation for Progressive Condition Arts, providing resources for artists dealing with degenerative diseases to continue their creative work in evolving forms. Izzy's story became a case study in medical schools and rehabilitation programs, demonstrating the importance of helping patients find ways to partner with their conditions rather than only viewing them as enemies to defeat. 2 years after her AGT performance, Izzy published a book called Dancing with Disease, Finding Art in Adversity, which became required reading in both medical humanities and adaptive arts programs. During her book tour, speaking with movements that showed clear progression of her Huntington's, Izzy would tell audiences, my disease is taking my control, but it can't take my creativity. So I've learned to let my symptoms be my choreographer, to let my condition be my co-creator. I'm not the same dancer I was 3 years ago, but I'm still a dancer, just dancing with a different partner now. She would demonstrate movement from her wheelchair, showing how adaptation had become its own art form, how limitation had become innovation. The goal isn't to overcome your condition, she would say. The goal is to create something beautiful with whatever abilities you have, for as long as you have them. The lesson Isabella Rodriguez taught the world that night is profound. Genetic destiny doesn't have to equal creative destiny. Medical conditions can become artistic collaborators rather than just obstacles to overcome. And sometimes the most powerful art comes from learning to dance with rather than against the challenges that life writes into our DNA. Simon Cowell learned that being a judge sometimes means recognizing when someone isn't just performing despite their challenges. They're performing because of them, using their limitations as creative fuel rather than creative barriers. And Izzy proved that grace isn't about having perfect control. It's about finding beauty in whatever control remains, about making art from adversity, about choosing to create meaning even when genetics try to steal everything else. The golden confetti from that night has been swept away, but the golden moment it represented, when a dancer refused to let progressive disease end her story, when she turned genetic symptoms into artistic statements, when she proved that art finds a way even when the artist's body systematically fails, continues to inspire, to challenge assumptions about ability, and to prove that sometimes the most powerful performances are the ones that show us how to keep dancing when the music keeps changing against our will. In the end, Isabella Rodriguez didn't just dance her final controlled performance. She danced her transformation from someone fighting her condition to someone partnering with it, from someone mourning her limitations to someone mining them for artistic gold. And in doing so, she gave permission to everyone watching to work with their challenges rather than only against them, to find creativity in constraint, to understand that evolution isn't defeat. It's the most beautiful form of adaptation.